So with that, I again welcome you to the IOER-Forum series on the future of sustainability, and with our guest speaker today, Professor Louis Kotzé. We are very happy to have him here today. He's a research professor of law at the Faculty of Law, Northwest University in South Africa. And his research is dealing with topics of human rights, socio-ecological justice and environmental constitutionalism, law and the Anthropocene, and Earth system law. And he's certainly very active in the Earth system governance community. He has been the former co-chair of the Earth System Governance Network's Scientific Steering Committee. He's also an assistant editor of the journal Earth System Governance and co-convener of the network's Task Force on Earth System Law. He's also a member of the South African Academy of Sciences. He's also closely linked to Germany. He's been at the Potsdam Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies as a Klaus Töpfer Sustainability Fellow in 22, and most recently in 23 and 4 at the New Institute in Hamburg as a program chair of the project governing the planetary commons. So as you can see, we have good reasons to be happy about having him here against this background, and we look forward to your contribution on the future of sustainable development in the Anthropocene in search of an alternative paradigm. That was your title, Luis, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you for the kind introduction and also the invitation to be here today and to share some thoughts with you. As Mark has so kindly said, I am a lawyer. I come from a very specific global South African background. And I also try to approach the issues that I work on from this perspective. And hence, I also hope to share some thoughts with you on sustainable development within this context, and specifically how it manifests in law, and why I do not think it is, in essence, a principle that is socio-ecologically friendly and a legal principle that can actually support the well-being of the entire living order in the Anthropocene epoch. My contention is that sustainable development has instead rather contributed, and it continues to exacerbate the conditions that are responsible for creating the Anthropocene and its deepening socio-ecological crisis. And I would try to develop my argument today by reflecting very briefly, because as I understood from Mark, this has been done to some extent already by several of the other speakers. I will want to reflect on the ubiquitous influence of sustainable development on institutions concerned with human development by focusing very specifically on international environmental law, my area of expertise. And I want to examine the principles, sort of tenacious, even constitutional like grip on international environmental law and governance that generally seem to benefit only a very small subset, privileged subset of the global population at the expense of billions of vulnerable people, and of course a rapidly declining Earth system, as we know. But also looking forward in a more sort of optimistic tone, which I think is necessary in the times that we live in, and with the aim of trying to reimagine an alternative to sustainable development, I want to argue for the need to be open to other ways of seeing, of being, and of knowing that can endeavor to replace the hubristic epistemologies of dominance and mastery with alternative epistemologies of humility, of care, that international environmental law must also embrace in order to promote social ecological sustainability. And to that end, I want to employ the African notion of Ubuntu. And I want to argue that as an environmental ethic, Ubuntu promotes ideas of care, of custodianship, stewardship, and the sort of thinking that also underpins the rights of nature in Latin America, for example, and its cosmovisions. And to this end, I think Ubuntu is certainly an African onto-epistemology that might stand alongside other indigenous worldviews to provide sort of alternative ways of seeing, of being, of knowing to those that we've become used to under the very destructive reign of sustainability. And in this sense, I'm certainly not an expert in the areas that you all work in, but I hope to sort of at least point to other geographies of law in a certain sense to think about alternatives to sustainable development. Now, reflecting briefly on sort of the prominence and the place of sustainable development in international environmental law, I think that the form in which a new concept emerges and the extent to which it is adopted and popularized is very closely linked to expertise and to ideological, financial, and political power. So powerful actors are, as we know, able to frame issues. They set the parameters of legitimacy, what is accepted, what is not, and confine what is acceptable within mainstream limits. And this is also the case with the concept of sustainability. It is noticeable how few, if any, of the many definitions of sustainable development, and certainly not the Sustainable Development Goals, actually promote the sort of radical transformation that is required to deal with the exigencies of the Anthropocene, such as climate change, biodiversity loss, and the proposed 6 mass extinction. Now, how and why has sustainable development become a problem instead of the solution that it was always intended to be? And I think we pretty much know this, that the Brundtland Commission's 1987 report really laid the foundations for sustainable development to unfold in lockstep with neoliberalism. And sustainable development was essentially popularized through the Brundtland report to accommodate industrial capitalism in a sort of green, eco-modernist way for at least 2 reasons. There might be others as well. First, I think sustainable development could not be allowed at the time to impede profits yielded by the exploitation of natural resources. And second, it was assumed that technological solutions to environmental destruction and climate change would be delivered by the sort of market fundamentalism promoted by neoliberal dogma and the techno-fetishism hyped by ecological modernization. Now, the Brundtland report has had, of course, far-reaching impacts on our social institutions, including the institution of international environmental law during the past quarter century. And the Brundtland Commission's impossible brief was to try and square the circle of growth as a precondition for development and environmental protection, something it could never do and still cannot do. In an effort to do so, of course, the Commission, as we know, defines sustainable development as development that meets the needs of the present generations without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And this definition has really become dominant, but not necessarily consensual. One study published about 15 years ago, so it's a fairly old study already, estimated that there were more than 140 alternative and variously modified definitions of sustainable development, many of which are mutually exclusive, with the inevitable result that sustainable development has become a term that is increasingly regarded either as internally self-contradictory, an oxymoron, or at best, plagued by ambiguous or distorted definitions. This was one main finding of that study. It is precisely sustainable development's malleability that renders it so very attractive and also so easily appropriable, despite the fact that its normative power is fundamentally at odds with its failure to protect the environment and people, especially vulnerable people. It is endlessly remolded to legitimize environmental degradation in which it is complicit, to popularize government policies that prioritize growth over environmental protection in the weakest possible understanding of the term. And of course, to greenwash corporate social responsibility reports, and therefore also the massive destruction that the corporate world is occasioning on people and the environment. Now, after the World Conference on Environment and Development in 1987, sustainable development rapidly gained widespread support, and it was quickly insinuated into the operation of many social institutions to the extent that its arch proponent, Jeffrey Sachs, celebrates the past 30 years as, quote unquote, the age of sustainable development. Now, more importantly, for present purposes, sustainable development has also deeply penetrated legal and policy domains, especially international environmental law, with sustainable development having since become really the cornerstone of environmental law, if not its core principle. It is not unreasonable, I think, to say that the trajectories of sustainable development and international environmental law, in terms of their historical development, have overlapped to the extent that they have virtually had a common history since 1987. The links between development, environmental protection, and international environmental law were already tentatively drawn at the 1972 Stockholm Conference, that's the first big global conference on environmental protection. And it became progressively more explicit at all consecutive global environmental conferences every 20 years. Now, in view of its embeddedness in international environmental law, one might argue that sustainable development has even assumed a sort of an international constitutional law-like character, to the extent that it constitutes what environmental law is. It orientates the institutions of international environmental law, and it also forms the core ethical principle of international environmental law. Now, given the nature, for example, of the climate and environmental emergencies confronting us, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, and more recently the Paris Agreement, may be viewed as sort of international constitutional moments, very similar to the adoption of the United Nations Charter in 1945, really signaling, if not entirely effective, but at least an awareness by the global community that we are in a time of crisis and we probably need to do something about it. But sustainable development in its Brundtland guise has been fully absorbed through these global constitutional-like instruments and processes, including all of the global environmental conferences, into international environmental law. And it has even shaped or constituted, quite literally, the content, the form, and the objectives of many, if not all, of these multilateral environmental agreements. So sustainable development has become so integral to the international environmental law endeavor that some scholars, such as Marie Cordonnier-Segar, are convinced of the existence of a new body of law called International Sustainable Development Law. Now, whether one agrees or doesn't agree with Cordonnier-Segar, sustainable development appears to function as the sort of foundational constitutional principle, or in the South African German sense of the word, a Grundnorm of international environmental law. As international environmental law's guiding objective, and of even more concern, its deeply flawed core ethical orientation. And Mark has also just mentioned in previous talks, the sort of ethical dimensions of sustainable development have also been covered. So international environmental lawyers have, therefore, I think at least to some extent, we as lawyers have been complicit in entrenching a socio-ecologically destructive understanding of sustainable development in a body of law, international environmental law, whose overarching goal should be to advance environmental protection and protect vulnerable people in pursuit of ecological sustainability or planetary integrity, rather than pure economic development for the benefit of a few privileged human beings. Now, the Sustainable Development Goals, adopted by the General Assembly about 3 months after the Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement in 2015, are the political institutionalization of sustainable development. But unlike, of course, the Paris Agreement, which is binding but unenforceable, the SDGs are neither binding nor enforceable, and their influence on political action and social mobilization is patchy and questionable at best. It's a very recent study published in 2022 by Frank Bierman and others that I've also been involved with, assessing the political impact of the SDGs, has clearly shown. So the architects of the SDGs never ventured beyond the confines of weak, sustainable, anthropocentric sustainable development, and therefore dogmatically reinforced the new liberal sort of human development agenda that has been shaping international environmental law for almost half a century. So if the aim of the SDGs was genuine ecological sustainability or planetary integrity, which is another term, their drafters would not have aimed so low. So lack of normative ambition clearly remains a significant defect of international environmental law. We see this in the global climate laws, as well as its associated political programs such as the SDGs. So in sum, reflecting on the place and the effect of sustainable development in the realm of international environmental law, I would say that the history of sustainable development's embeddedness and sort of constitutional tenacity in international environmental law and quasi-legal development visions such as the SDGs suggest that we should not expect it to promote or ensure planetary integrity. In reality, under the paradigm of sustainable development, current international environmental law has been unable to shape a real or equitable answer to the global socio-ecological crisis. Now, turning to the issue of Ubuntu, and looking forward, hopefully in a more optimistic sense, I've argued that the idea and the reality of sustainable development are fundamentally at odds with the exigencies of the Anthropocene, and I think many others would agree with this. Many critics argue that sustainable development should be reinterpreted. But in my view, the concept is unsalvageable because its intrinsically contradictory nature produces promises that are unattainable. Many attempts to reconceptualize sustainable development have borne very little fruit, partially because its conceptual components, the environment, environmental protection, and its peculiar deployment of the core idea of sustainability are continually at risk of becoming irrelevant as a result of the erosion of planetary boundaries, advances in climate and environmental science, technological innovation, and of course also the advent of the Anthropocene, as Marcus also mentioned. We urgently, I think, therefore, and this is where we come to sort of exploring the potential of new spaces, geographies, openings, we need new principles. We need new principles to inform our social institutions, such as international environmental law, that can better guide human behavior in the Anthropocene to promote the well-being of the entire living order, including specifically of vulnerable living beings, in an equitable and just way, while also preserving planetary integrity. Certainly a big ask and ambitious, but therefore all the better reason to talk about it. Now, I think that a precondition for reframing and reimagining our current regulatory regimes would be a sense of openness to alternative ways of seeing things, of being, and of knowing that can produce epistemologies of care and humility, of vulnerability, instead of hubristic epistemologies of dominance and mastery, such as those produced by sustainable development. Epistemologies of care and humility are predicated upon a relational sense of solidarity that recognizes that the subjugation and suffering of one is, in fact, indicative of the oppression of everyone. So we need conceptual frameworks commensurate with the scale and the urgency of the demands of the socio-ecological crisis of the Anthropocene. The radical new openings that Redcliffe, for example, calls for, that can steer us away from the ecological destruction that sustainable development facilitates. So I want to conclude this brief conversation by outlining the possibilities offered by the African notion of Ubuntu as one example of such an epistemology of care and humility. And of course, there are others. There's Buen Vivir in Latin America, Maori cosmovisions. But I thought it might be interesting to specifically reflect a little bit on the African context. So whereas other indigenous cosmovisions, such as Buen Vivir, have led to legal changes, and we see this very clearly, specifically in the jurisprudence and case law emerging from Latin America, specifically around rights of nature, indigenous African onto-epistemologies, such as Ubuntu, are relatively still underdeveloped, I would say, despite the adoption of the concept, especially by Southern African courts, especially the South African Constitutional Court and some of the lower courts in South Africa. I do believe, however, as do others, that Ubuntu can be used as an onto-epistemological principle through which the well-being of the entire living order can be reimagined, and therefore, as an alternative to sustainable development. I think it has the potential, at least, to infuse humans with a consciousness of wholeness, of interdependence on each other and on our natural, so-called natural surroundings, including a sort of a spiritual level of being. Now, what is Ubuntu? Very, very briefly, it is a sub-Saharan onto-epistemology and ethical framework, which has gained purchase as a constitutional value even, a practice, and as a philosophy in the Southern African region, particularly in South Africa. Ubuntu has been defined in various ways, for example, as a collection of values and practices that people of Africa or of African origin view as making people authentic human beings. Now, while the nuances of these values and practices vary across different ethnic groups, they all point to one thing. An authentic individual human being is part of a larger and much more significant relational, communal, societal, environmental, and spiritual world. So the meaning of Ubuntu is certainly related also to its etymology in South African Nguni languages, such as isiZulu, and essentially refers to human nature, humanness, good disposition of heart. A person who does not live by Ubuntu has no humanness of heart, no feeling for one another. And reflecting on its essence of relationality, because this is really what the principle is all about, relationality. Van Noren explains that Ubuntu means the continuous motion of the unfoldment of the universe, abstract Ubu, brought to life by the life force Ntu, also understood as I am because we are. A person is a person through other persons. Anna Greer, for example, argues that relationality, on which she so beautifully writes, illuminates what she says, the agentic entanglement of humans with a planetary field of radically distributed, multiplicitous agentic forces. We are all intertwined. So Ubuntu is clearly rooted in a sense of relationality, caring and sharing, in which humanness is derived from membership of a community of beings, where the humanity of an individual is only complete if it reaffirms that of others. It is an ontology that stresses the value of compassion and relatedness, and as life as mutual aid. It does not know the word development, as some scholars say, and instead stresses the idea of humaneness in all human and non-human relations. And this is a core element in a philosophy about how we ought to relate to the other, what our moral obligations would be towards the other, both humans and non-humans. So Ubuntu therefore views humans as an essential part also of the non-human world, that who we are is inextricably linked to others. Our identity emerges from positive relationships with others, including non-humans, and not in opposition to or isolation from them. So in essence, our deepest moral obligation is to become more fully human. And to achieve this requires one to enter more deeply into community with others, also non-humans. Now, in the environmental context, Ubuntu has been deployed, if only mostly conceptually still, to counter neoliberalism's tendency to undermine community agency and to promote environmental protection. One scholar, for example, contends that Ubuntu can be used to develop a relational alternative to sustainable development, consistent with theories of degrowth. Ubuntu has also been invoked to introduce an indigenous African perspective into the discourse on environmental protection against the backdrop of colonialism, certainly in terms of decolonial studies. And Van Breda argues that Ubuntu includes a commitment to save the earth from the greed of humanity through ecological or eco-spiritual social work even. And in a similar vein, others contend that Ubuntu is a living ethics that embodies an ecological ethics that could inspire socialist imaginaries in the battle against climate change, for example. So the underlying assumption, surely, of many of these views is that the essential element of Ubuntu, or elements of Ubuntu rather, namely humility, relationality, humaneness, compassion for others, and concern for collective well-being, can be used to promote environmental protection. Now, although Ubuntu emerged in pre-colonial times in Southern Africa as a maxim governing human behavior and a reproach against inhumane conduct, it also has since become a legal principle and even a constitutional value in post-apartheid South Africa, when it was invoked in the name of reconciliation and healing of a very deeply divided and unjust society. Now, the interim constitution of 1993 of the country, which paved the way for the final constitution in 1996, the one that we still have, contained a sort of a post-amble, which called for Ubuntu rather than vengeance for colonial and apartheid excesses during the transition period that led eventually to democracy. So it was very explicit in the interim constitution that Ubuntu is the principle which should guide the transition period. Now, the Constitutional Court has since then certainly elevated Ubuntu to a constitutional value even, despite the fact that it is not explicitly mentioned even as a constitutional value in our final constitution. So the Constitutional Court regards Ubuntu as an indigenous value that should form part of South African constitutional law in order to create an inclusive jurisprudence that recognizes the value of indigenous maxims and norms in adjudication. And it was, for example, used by the Constitutional Court to end the death penalty in 1995 in the famous case of State versus Makwanyane, where the apex court held that the death penalty is incompatible with a democratic country that prides itself for respecting human rights and dignity. And today, certainly, South African courts invoke Ubuntu in cases ranging from constitutional law to contract law. Interestingly, though, while no South African court has yet relied on Ubuntu to adjudicate very clearly or specifically an environmental-related dispute, it is probably only a matter of time. I and others as well think before this actually happens or will happen. Courts will be able then to draw on a series of precedents in which Ubuntu has been recognized, albeit in the broader context of social justice. But relying on Ubuntu in an environmental context, I think, could offer courts a real interesting and exciting opportunity to appreciate that human conduct that imperils the livelihoods of others, such as building a coal-fired power plant close to poor informal settlements, as we call them in South Africa, townships, places the survival of those communities in peril by endangering the foundations of life on which their survival depends. So as an indigenous way of seeing, of being, and of knowing, Ubuntu stands in direct contrast in this sense to sustainable development's anthropocentric, top-down, techno-managerial framing of socio-ecological breakdown and unrelatedness, individual autonomy, human mastery, that sort of reproduce hierarchies while ignoring the insights also of indigenous epistemologies about relationality and the vulnerability of our deeply intertwined relationships with other vulnerable humans and the non-human world. Ubuntu promotes humility and care for others and viewing humans not as independent, self-sufficient individuals, but instead as part of the larger community of life that supports us all. Now, in conclusion, I think it's fair to say that since the publication of Our Common Future in 1987, sustainable development has become the hegemonic conception of development. It has prompted so many businesses, governments, academic and non-governmental publications and gatherings that it has been dubbed the mantra that launched 1,000 conferences. And this is true. Like the idea of development, it has spawned an industry that is promoted through the vested interests of scholars, lobbyists, politicians, and development economists. As Upton Sinclair acidly observed in a publication, and I quote here, "It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it." End of quote. To the extent that it conceals predatory and destructive development practices and the dire state of planetary integrity and the well-being of the living order in the context of the Anthropocene, sustainable development certainly reinforces hierarchical relationships between the powerful and other vulnerable humans and non-humans. It is falsely presented as the solution to the ineffectiveness of our laws and institutions to curb the environmental burden of modern civilization. The core problem with sustainable development is that it deepens the problems it pretends to solve because of its oxymoronic nature. Endless compound growth on a finite planet marked by planetary boundaries cannot be ecologically sustainable. Sustainable development's intrinsic contradictions therefore makes it incapable of mediating irreconcilable tensions between economic growth and extractive development on the one hand, and planetary integrity on the other. And these tensions, I think, have really been laid bare now in the Anthropocene, which is a crisis of hierarchy characterized by climatic harms, massive, urgent, destructive climatic harms, amongst many other disruptors. And climate change is a crisis that will endure long into the future. It cannot be solved through sustainable development, which epitomizes Einstein's observation that insanity is repeatedly doing the same thing, but expecting different results. We know what the problem is, what we need to do, and I would argue that we even have the means to do it. The problem, of course, as we know, is the collective failure of political will to bring about radical structural transformations. Finding new, different, and better ways of being human by learning from also non-Eurocentric epistemology, such as Ubuntu, may enable us to better address, I hope, the Anthropocene socio-ecological crisis from which humanity might just still recover before it becomes a catastrophe from which there certainly will be absolutely no way back.
Thank you, Luis, for this very intriguing talk today and a very good starter for our discussion.